For 80 years, Japan stayed quiet. No weapons exports, no offensive military posture, no arms deals with allies or anyone else. It was the unspoken rule written in the ash of World War II, a nation that once terrorized half of Asia, promising the world it would never do so again. That rule is now gone. On April 21, 2026, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's cabinet made a decision that sent shockwaves across every defense ministry in Asia. Japan officially lifted its ban on lethal weapons exports, warships, fighter jets, combat drones, missiles, all of it now cleared for sale to allied nations around the world. This wasn't a minor policy tweak. This was the single biggest transformation in Japanese defense posture since the end of World War II. And in Beijing, the reaction was exactly what you would expect from a rising power that has spent the last decade trying to dominate the Western Pacific. They didn't stay silent. So what exactly just happened? Why did Japan do this now? And why does it matter so much to the United States, to China, and to every nation sitting in the shadow of this brewing Indo-Pacific rivalry? The answer goes much deeper than a policy document. This is about 80 years of restraint finally giving way to reality. To understand why this is so significant, you have to go back to 1945. When Japan surrendered at the end of World War II, the country didn't just lose a war, it was fundamentally reshaped. Article 9 of Japan's post-war constitution, written largely under American influence, renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited Japan from maintaining war potential. For decades, that clause defined Japanese identity, a country that had turned its back on militarism and chosen a different path. But there was always a quiet tension beneath that identity. Japan sits at one of the most strategically contested crossroads on the planet. To its west is China, a nation that has spent 2 decades building the largest naval force in the world by ship count. To its north is Russia, increasingly aggressive after its full-scale war in Europe. And just across a narrow sea is North Korea, a nuclear-armed regime that routinely launches ballistic missiles over Japanese territory. For decades, Japan responded to these threats carefully. It maintained the Japan Self-Defense Forces, technically a military, technically not a military, and spent carefully, always keeping its defense budget under 1% of GDP as a symbolic ceiling. And when it came to weapons exports, it was even more cautious. For most of the post-war era, Japan exported almost nothing lethal. Then the world changed faster than the policy could keep up. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow but deliberate chain of decisions that began accelerating in the 2000s. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe started the process in 2014 when he eased the original export restrictions for the first time, allowing some defense equipment to flow to allies. In 2023, his successors went further, permitting the export of completed lethal weapons for the first time since the war. But there were still enormous restrictions. Japan could only export in 5 narrow categories: rescue equipment, transport, warning systems, surveillance gear, and minesweeping technology. None of that was going to deter a Chinese carrier strike group. Now even that framework has been abolished entirely. What does the new policy actually allow? Japan can now sell warships to allied nations. It can sell fighter jets, including the next generation. Stealth aircraft Japan is co-developing with the United Kingdom and Italy. It can sell combat drones, anti-ship missiles, destroyers, and advanced radar systems. Initially, exports are limited to 17 nations that have signed defense equipment and technology transfer agreements with Japan, countries that include the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, the Philippines, and others across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Each export still requires approval from Japan's National Security Council. And Japan says it will in principle continue to avoid selling weapons to nations actively engaged in armed conflict, with one notable exception. Countries that have defense treaties with Japan can still receive weapons even in conflict conditions. Read that again. That exception is not small. It is a strategic trapdoor that fundamentally changes the calculus of any future conflict in the Pacific. Now let's talk about what Japan is actually building, because the hardware matters as much as the policy. Japan's defense industry has operated in near isolation for most of the post-war period. Unlike the United States, Germany, France, or the United Kingdom, Japan never developed a robust arms export ecosystem. Its companies built excellent equipment, some of the world's most advanced destroyer-class warships, cutting-edge radar systems, precision munitions, but almost all of it stayed inside Japan's own self-defense forces. That changes now, and the implications for the global arms market are considerable. Japan's Mogami-class frigates are regarded as among the most capable light warships in the world, built for submarine detection and multi-domain warfare in the contested waters of the Western Pacific. Japan's Type 12 anti-ship missile has been upgraded to become a land attack weapon with a range that can threaten targets deep inside adversary territory. The FX, Japan's sixth-generation fighter jet developed alongside the UK and Italy under the Global Combat Air Program, is expected to be one of the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet when it enters service in the 2030s. For decades, none of this was going anywhere. Now it can go to the Philippines, to India, to European partners defending against Russian aggression, to any of the 17 nations that have signed on to Japan's defense framework, with more likely to follow. Japan's defense revenue was already surging before this announcement. The country raised its defense budget to 2% of GDP, a symbolic and practical doubling of its previous commitment. Revenue at Japan's 5 largest defense companies jumped 40% in 2024 alone. This new export policy is the engine that will drive that growth for decades to come. And then there is China. Beijing's reaction to Japan's defense evolution has been consistent, loud, and increasingly aggressive. China's defense ministry has warned repeatedly that Japan's military buildup raises vigilance and concerns among people worldwide. A Chinese military spokesperson said explicitly that regional nations will not allow Japanese militarism to make a comeback. That language is not accidental. China consistently invokes the memory of World War II-era Japanese militarism when it talks about Japan's rearmament. It is a strategic communications choice, framing every Japanese defense upgrade not as a response to Chinese aggression, but as a revival of historical imperialism. It puts Japan on the defensive rhetorically, even as China expands its military footprint across the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and increasingly into the Western Pacific. The numbers behind China's concerns are revealing. China has been conducting what Japan's own defense ministry describes as escalated military activities, including over 1,200 takeoffs and landings from aircraft carriers operating in the Pacific in a single year. It has accelerated the construction of its own carriers, expanded its submarine fleet, and deployed advanced anti-access weapons designed specifically to push American forces back from the First Island chain. Japan sits at the center of that First Island chain. The Ryukyu Island arc stretches from Japan's main island southwest toward Taiwan, creating a natural geographic barrier between the open Pacific and China's coastline. For China to project power eastward, for its carriers to operate freely in the Pacific, for its submarines to transit without constraint, it has to deal with Japan. And for the United States to defend Taiwan, South Korea, and the broader Pacific order, Japan is not just an ally. Japan is the geographic foundation on which that entire defensive architecture rests. When Japan lifts its arms export ban and begins supplying the Philippines with warships and the United Kingdom with fighter jet components, it isn't just building its own defense industry. It is plugging into a web of deterrence that directly constrains Chinese freedom of action across the entire First Island chain. That is why Beijing is not simply annoyed. That is why they are alarmed. Now, consider what this means for the United States specifically. Washington has long been Japan's primary security guarantor. The U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty has been the cornerstone of Pacific security since 1960. For decades, that relationship was asymmetric. The United States provided the offensive punch, and Japan provided the basing, the intelligence cooperation, and the defensive layer around its own territory. That asymmetry is ending. Japan is now a country with a growing offensive capability, an arms industry plugged into the global market, and a government that has explicitly decided the post-war pacifist model is no longer adequate for the world it actually lives in. Prime Minister Takaichi stated it plainly when she signed off on the new guidelines. In an increasingly severe environment, no single country can protect its own peace and security alone. For the United States, this is strategically valuable in ways that go beyond the obvious alliance benefit. A Japan that exports weapons is a Japan whose defense industry is integrated with allied supply chains. When the US needs to surge munitions production, as it has discovered painfully through the Ukraine conflict, Japan's factories become part of that industrial base. When the Philippines needs anti-ship missiles to defend its own maritime claims against Chinese pressure, Japan can supply them directly without routing everything through Washington. When India wants advanced warships that aren't American and aren't Russian, Japan is now an option. The American defense establishment has watched the Ukraine war reveal a brutal truth. Stockpiles run out, production takes time, and allies matter enormously, not just militarily, but industrially. Japan's entry into the global arms market is, from Washington's perspective, exactly the kind of allied burden sharing that strategists have been asking for since the Cold War. But nothing in geopolitics comes without risk, and Japan's gamble carries its own set of dangers. The first is escalation. China has consistently treated Japanese rearmament as a provocation, and the harder-line voices in Beijing have used it to justify their own military expansion. There is a feedback loop here, Japanese deterrence buildup driving Chinese counter buildup, which drives further Japanese investment, which drives further Chinese alarm. At some point, that loop stops being about deterrence and starts becoming about the conditions for a crisis neither side fully controls. The second risk is credibility. Japan's new export policy includes exceptions and conditions. The National Security Council must approve each sale. Weapons sold to conflict-affected zones require special circumstances justification. Critics inside Japan have already questioned whether these guardrails are clear enough. If Japan's weapons end up contributing to a conflict in a way that violates the spirit of its post-war identity, the domestic political backlash could be severe. And the third risk is the one nobody wants to say out loud: miscalculation. The Taiwan Strait remains the single most dangerous flashpoint in the world right now. If China ever moves against Taiwan, and Beijing has never renounced the use of force, Japan is automatically on the front line. Japanese bases will be targeted. Japanese supply lines will be contested. A Japan that has spent the last decade building an offensive missile capability, an upgraded naval force, and an arms export infrastructure is a Japan that China cannot simply ignore in any conflict scenario involving Taiwan. That changes the deterrence math significantly, but it also raises the stakes of any miscalculation to a level the region has not seen since 1945. What Japan did on April 21, 2026, was not simply sign a new trade policy. It was a declaration, carefully worded, diplomatically packaged, but unmistakably clear that the post-war era is over. For 80 years, Japan absorbed the lessons of its own catastrophic militarism and chose restraint as its national identity. That restraint served a purpose. It rebuilt trust. It rebuilt the economy. It made Japan a respected partner rather than a feared rival. But restraint has a cost when the world around you stops being restrained. China has not stopped building. North Korea has not stopped testing. Russia has not stopped fighting. And the post-war order that made Japanese pacifism viable, anchored by American dominance, stable global trade, and functioning international institutions, is under more pressure than it has been since the Cold War. Japan looked at that world and made a choice. Not a reckless choice, not a warmongering choice, but a clear-eyed strategic choice that the window for staying passive had closed. The question now is not whether Japan's transformation will change the Indo-Pacific balance of power. It already has. The question is whether the deterrence it creates will hold, or whether it will, as deterrence sometimes does, bring the very confrontation it was designed to prevent one step closer to the surface. That answer won't come in a policy document. It will come in the South China Sea, in the skies above the East China Sea, and in the decisions made in Beijing by leaders who now have to calculate not just American power, but Japanese resolve. And Japan has made very clear that its resolve is no longer theoretical.